Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We're really excited to have you all here. There are so many of you here in the room to listen to our masterclass today, which is extremely exciting. We have an awesome speaker lined up for you all. I'll give a little bit of an introduction. We're so excited to have Professor Satchu here leading us in today's session. He is a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School and a founder and managing partner at AlignVest. At Harvard, he belongs to the Entrepreneurship Management unit, teaching courses like Entrepreneurship, Entrepreneurial Managers, and Founder Mindset, which is very similar to the topic of our masterclass session today. And with his work at AlignVest, this is a private investment company controlled by Professor Satchu that has founded and built several businesses. So we're really excited to learn from his experiences today, and I hope you all can engage with our topic. With that, I think I'm ready to turn it over to you, Professor Satchu, unless you have anything else questions to ask me.
I think we're ready to roll. Thanks very much, Jenny. So let's get started then. And you know, it's great to see everyone. You know, this is an organization that I have supported from the beginning and have been thrilled to see its growth. And so, you know, one of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about is, what are the mindsets required to achieve the impact that all of us, you know, individually we have our own set of impact, but we all sort of have this desire to have an impact on the world, okay, or some part of it in any event. Maybe just before I get started, what I'd ask you to do is just to take a minute and just sort of dare to dream. Tell me, what is the impact? Write it down. What is the impact that you want to have? However you define it. Okay, so you're starting off your lives. You're sort of thinking about where it's all going to go. And if you sort of just say, you know what, the impact that I want to have looks like what? If you can just tell me with some degree of specificity what that looks like. So maybe just take 30 seconds just to write that down. Okay, so let me just ask someone, you know, this impact point, which I think is the fundamental driver that all of us have, which is at a minimum, we want to have a positive impact on the people we care about, right? And that can be as small as our family, that can be our village, that can be all the way up to the world, frankly. So can someone I just would love to hear from someone the impact that they hope to have through a life well lived. Okay, so listen, here's what I'd say, and you can see it in the chat, right? What you can see is that there are these points of impact that each of you have share a lot in common, right? They are almost invariably bigger than yourself. They typically involve some sort of experience that you might have had in your childhood, and they are all very large. And at this stage in your life, there's all of you, I hope, believe that although it may not be likely, it is certainly achievable. That you want to do the things that you put in the chat and be able to have this massive impact where you're materially changing the lives in a positive manner of the people that you care about. And so the question then is how do you go about achieving this impact? Like, how do you actually think about what it would take to have a mindset where you can achieve this massive impact? And fully aware that some people are coming from places where it might be extraordinarily hard given the lack of capital and perhaps some opportunities, lesser opportunities, but also aware that you're all here to aspire because you're trying to improve your probability of success and aspire to this impact. And invariably, when you think about how you go about having that impact, many would say, well, being an entrepreneur will get me there, right? This idea that I could create a company or a business that creates jobs, that will give me resources, that will give me learning, that will be a path for me to then have impact, right? And so this seems like a very attractive path. You kind of, why would you want to be an entrepreneur? Well, there's some sort of initial reasons, like, you've got an opportunity for power and control and money. But ultimately, it's really about the learning and the impact that you might be able to have. And the path there feels, although risky, feels like a very viable path for many. And so the question then is, and I don't have the capability to do this, but if I ask you, how many of you, would want to be an entrepreneur? Many of you would say, yes, that's something that I would like to do. And the reasons why you'd like to do it is because of, different people have different reasons, but invariably it'll be things like, it's an opportunity to have control over my life. It's an opportunity to gather resources. It's an opportunity to learn as much as possible. It's an opportunity to improve the community. And then ultimately, it's an opportunity to have the credibility and the resources to have the impact that you want to have. And so all of these things are really great things, but yet so few people make this leap into entrepreneurship, despite the fact that in many ways it's the path that can get you the impact that you all want. And so the question is why? Why is it that it's so hard to make the leap and to commit to being an entrepreneur? And so the many people will say, well, I define entrepreneurship as the relentless pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. The key part being the second path, which is without regard to resources currently controlled. And so when you think about that, you think to yourself, well, that seems like a silly thing to do because I want to have as much information. I want to have everything lined up before I make a jump, because otherwise I'm taking undue risk. And so what invariably happens is you get paralyzed by the decision making, right? And so as an example, you might see an idea, and I'm sure many of you see ideas, right? There are ideas everywhere. All you need to do is sort of write down all the things that you think could run better in your life on a daily basis, and those are ideas. The problem isn't that you won't come up with ideas. The problem is that you won't believe that your ideas have any validity to them. And the reason you won't believe that, and it's quite logical, is because you will think to yourself, well, surely someone else with more resources, with more money, with more capital, with more relationships, would have come up with this idea. And that all seems very logical. So you don't actually explore the ideas because you think, well, it's kind of a waste because it's not such a unique, brilliant idea. But surely someone else with more resources will have thought of it and discarded it. Now, the flaw in that logic is most great entrepreneurs would never have launched if they thought that way. So let me give an example. If you look at Jeff Bezos at Amazon, I mean, his first product was selling books online. There were thousands of people whose only job at retail bookstores was to sell books, right? Barnes & Noble was a public company with a $10 billion market cap that did nothing but sell books. And there were hundreds of people in the strategy department at Barnes & Noble who were charged with thinking about how to sell more books. And yet here's a guy who perhaps has read a couple of books, but has no informational advantage around how to distribute books, doesn't have any real meaningful capital. He ends up creating what ends up being the world's biggest bookstore, precisely because he was willing to explore his idea and not just assume that others with more resources surely would have come up with the idea. Let's take another example. Elon Musk. I can promise you there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who were working at some of the largest companies in the world, Ford, General Motors, Toyota, etc., whose only job was to think about how to sell more cars. And today, Tesla, which didn't exist 20 years ago, the value of Tesla is greater than the cumulative value of the next 10 largest car companies. Okay? Car companies that had been in existence for 50, 60, 70 years completely missed this whole proposition of electric cars. And so it's very interesting to sort of think about, well, on the one hand, how can it be that people who don't have all the information, who don't have all the resources, in fact, are competing against companies that perhaps should have come up with these ideas and that have far more resources, how can those people actually build things of significance? And obviously I've picked two very, extremely successful entrepreneurs, but I would suggest that every entrepreneur the most critical thing they did initially was to actually explore the idea they had and to actually give themselves permission to not immediately kill it by saying someone else with more resources could surely do this, but rather to be curious and to actually think about, okay, maybe there's an opportunity here. And so certainly if I think about the businesses I've built, almost invariably, they are businesses that others would say someone else with more capital should have built them. I tell a story of I was living in New York at the time and went back to Toronto to visit my parents, and I looked out the window from the airport, driving into the city, and there were 10 self-storage sites, one after the other on this highway in the outskirts of Toronto. And I thought to myself, well, why would there be these storage facilities kind of right beside each other? It doesn't make sense, especially given when I was in New York or San Francisco, you have these storage facilities that are right downtown, multi-story, not these single-story things in the middle of, in the outskirts. And, I suppose the decision that I made that ended up creating the business wasn't that I had the idea of what's going on, because I can promise you millions of other people looked at the same window and thought the same thing, but rather that I stopped the car and went into these storage facilities to find out what's going on. And it was through that set of interactions that I realized there was a real opportunity to build a business. The point is, I think if for those of you who are thinking about wanting to be entrepreneurs and founders, one of the key things you need to do early on is trust your instincts and explore your ideas. It is a critically important part of the entrepreneurial journey. And in many ways, you have to suspend disbelief that other people who have far more resources have just missed these opportunities, right? And the reason I talk about Amazon and Tesla is because these were not two individuals who won because they had the most resources or because they had the most information, okay? And so it is critically important that you don't immediately dismiss your ideas, okay? When you see an idea, just explore it, talk to the customer, figure out what's happening. And it is not a terribly consequential move, okay? So that's the first thing I would say in terms of judgment, right? And so ultimately what this means is you need to start trusting your judgment. If I had to, I have a definition of learning. People always say, oh, you want to maximize learning, and people don't really, no one really gives a articulate definition of learning. And what I'd say to me, what learning is making consequential decisions that you are accountable for, okay? So making consequential decisions that you are accountable for. The reason that's learning okay, is because you are being forced to trust your judgment, right? The reason these decisions are consequential is because they're uncertain. And it's in that uncertainty, or it's in that moment of discomfort with imperfect information, where you start trusting the skill that I think is the most important skill as a leader you can develop, which is judgment, okay? And you can imagine the other extreme, which is, I believe judgment is just like any other muscle, and it is something one has to practice, okay, early in their lives. And so, I often say that, people who come from difficult backgrounds, right? In many ways, they have had obstacles not of their own choosing forced on them early in their lives, right? And it's one of the benefits of that, right, is that you're actually forced, you learn a lot about yourself, right? Because of that discomfort and that uncertainty, you are forced to start practicing your judgment because of that discomfort. And oftentimes it's exactly those kinds of people who make for really great founders, because they know what they're capable of, okay? And so to me, it all starts with practicing your judgment on small things, such that you have confidence that you're able to operate on the big things. And so, if you think about, judgment lies in the space between confidence and capabilities, right? If you think about it, right? So imagine the other extreme, which is you always had to be in situations where your capabilities were greater than your confidence. You would never actually learn anything because there's no discomfort there, right? Meaning you're capable enough. Whereas if you think about a world where there's a gap between your confidence and capabilities, meaning your confidence doesn't border on arrogance, but you're willing to actually operate in situations of discomfort, it's exactly there where you start practicing your judgment, okay? And so I would encourage you, as you think about this founder mindset, is to practice your judgment on small things where there is some discomfort, where there is some risk, and through that practice, you will start trusting your judgment more, which is ultimately the thing that you most need in order to build anything of consequence, okay? The other thing I want to just quickly talk about is this concept that's all, that people talk about, which is sort of this concept of founder market fit, which is, and it's related to what I'm saying, which is that somehow you need to have extraordinary experience and knowledge to build something in that space. And what I'd say is, again, I think what you need is to have a unique and interesting insight, okay, and then be very resilient and creative as to how you're gonna capitalize on it, okay. This concept of founder market fit is a bullseye that I think very few people actually achieve. I would rather you think about being a founder not as I need to have this beautiful fit, but rather this is the kind of life I want to lead, which is one where I'm making consequential decisions, learning as much as possible, and practicing my judgment. And so, perhaps if you think about the hardest thing to do, right, as a founder or as a budding founder, is to actually commit something, right? Because, of course, all of us are scared about that commitment, right? That we're also scared that, oh my God, if I commit to something, I may lose all these other options. And I may be in a position where, because I don't have those options, I may fail, it may be very problematic, okay? And so what I would say to you is, the problem with evaluating things and not being committed is you will never actually know what you're capable of, okay? You will just, it's like going into war with not one, but two arms tied behind your back. Because if you think about it, you're going to be uncommitted, not knowing, and competing with people who are fully committed. So it's going to feel unwinnable, and it is unwinnable. And so there are two things that happen with commitment, right? One is the most obvious one, which is you learn what you're capable of, okay? Meaning it's only until you jump in the deep end you really learn whether you can swim, okay? And so you truly learn what you're capable of. But the other thing is, which I'd say it's when the magic happens, which is when you commit. And this, I'm not suggesting this happens all the time. I'm just suggesting that in my experience, the magic happens when you commit because people see the ambition, the fear, the commitment, the desperation, the determination, the ambition in your eyes. And they want to help you. They want to be part of that journey. So your first customer shows up, your first employee shows up, hopefully your first investor shows up, precisely because of the commitment. And so, magic happens when you commit for exactly that reason, right? It's the same thing when you find someone you want to, if you have a partner, right? It's through that commitment that something magical can happen. And so I often times meet with students who will make a decision not to found based on looking in from the outside. And the problem is they just will never know, right? The evaluation they are making is one that is flawed because they don't know what's possible. Okay, they don't know what they might be capable of, and they don't know who might show up to help. Because as an example, I get asked all the time to either invest or help students, and the first thing I ask is, are you committed? Because I'm not committing to you unless you're committed to the idea. And so it's this commitment point's very important. Now, obviously, you need to think hard about whether you're at a life and a stage where you can do this. But what I don't want you thinking is that somehow sitting on the sidelines, you're able to evaluate the true return of jumping in and the true upside optionality, okay? When people say they're not sure if they want to be a founder or an entrepreneur, or a founder or not, I have a very simple and quite harsh test for them. And I'd ask you guys to think about this as well. Okay, and presumably you're interested in this topic because you're intrigued by being founders, or you are founders. But here's a question that'll make you answer this. I think answer this more clearly. Is, let's assume you're in the end of your life. Okay, hopefully many decades, and you only have two choices, two outcomes. Okay, one outcome is that you tried and failed. The other outcome is you never tried. Okay, whatever trying means to you. In my case, it's trying to be a founder. So there's no outcome where you tried and succeeded, which obviously is an outcome, but is one that I'm saying just exit out. And the reality is the true founders know that the only thing worse than trying and failing is not trying at all. Because at least you swung the bat. And hopefully you learned something. And frankly, hopefully you actually got back up and did it again. And oh, by the way, there's some real chance that you might have succeeded. So the point is I think it's a very interesting question as you think about, what does risk look like and how do I actually move forward with it? On this point around judgment, okay, and we'll come back to commitment in a minute because I see the chat saying commitment is scary, and I'll deal with that in a minute. On this point of judgment, okay, I want to just talk a little bit more about this because ultimately everything starts with judgment. Even the decision to commit is a judgment that you have to make, okay? So I want you to think about those judgments, not just from a downside perspective, which is, okay, what if I get it wrong? What does it look like? But also from an upside perspective, okay? Which is, imagine a world where I start trusting my judgment. Like imagine a world where, I don't get it right all the time, but I've got enough swings at bat when it comes to judgment that I start actually trusting my judgment. And so it doesn't feel like it's as risky as it used to. The risk-adjusted trade-off is different because I now have experience trusting my judgment. And so it's interesting because if you start that process, there's two things that happen. One is you don't do what most people do, which is overstate the downside and understate the upside. You actually start moving it in a way where it actually reaches an equilibrium. But you also get the benefit of what I call sort of exponential learning, right? Which is, it's not linear. It's like a snowball, right? It's exponential, meaning every judgment you make allows you to make the next set of judgments in a more profound, better way. Okay. And so if you say at the core of the founder mindset is making more and better judgments, and learning from those that you get wrong. It is an exponential thing where it leads you to a path where you learn the most, and you hopefully can have the impact that you want to have. Okay, I want to talk about, so the way I think about this is you have judgment, commitment, okay, I'll call it magic, and then impact. Okay, so let's just go through each one of these. These are sort of my four very straightforward pieces of the founder mindset. Okay, so judgment we've talked about, right? Judgment is all about putting yourself in situations of discomfort where there's imperfect information, and really operating in that space, knowing, even at a small level, that that's the place where you learn the most because you're testing your judgment. Okay. And ultimately, the most important judgment you're going to have to make is when to commit. Okay. And this means that it is uncertain. It does involve risk. As part of that risk calculation, it can't just be all about the downside. It has to be also about the possibilities of what you might uncover and what you might learn. Okay. And in that commitment is where what I call the magic happens, right? Where you actually start getting the benefits of exponential learning. You learn the most about yourself and what you're capable of. People show up, and hopefully you build something of consequence, such that not at the end of your life, in the middle of your life, or as soon as possible, you actually have the credibility and the resources to actually have the impact that you want, right? At the end of the day, building a business isn't just about making money. It's about actually having the resources and the credibility to actually do the thing that I think everyone wants to do most, which is have the freedom to have a positive impact on people. Okay. So I would think a lot about that. And again, this concept of risk calibration, okay? The most important point I can make here is none of you have all the resources you would like, okay? And they do matter. I agree. Resources matter, but every entrepreneur I know was resource constrained. They didn't have what they wanted in terms of resources. And frankly, there were others like Barnes & Noble or General Motors who had far more resources. And so the mindset has to be one where you're opportunity driven and not resource constrained. Okay, so most large companies think about the world as confined resources. They've got constrained resources. That's what they allocate. Most entrepreneurs think about it purely as opportunity driven. Okay, and then figuring out how do they actually get those resources. But the first thing they need to do is they have to actually believe it's possible. Okay, and that people are missing things. So let me give a story. Okay, so I was born in Kenya, in Mombasa, and I'm sure there are several Kenyans, Jambo, Bariako, and I left when I was eight years old. Okay, and we got to Kenya. No one, my parents had not gone to college. We started without much, and for me, getting to Canada, or for our family getting to Canada, was a pretty monumental thing because it put us on a path where both my brother and I got well educated and ended up building businesses. Okay, but I always thought to myself, like many of you, I'm sure, to myself, well, you know what? One day, hopefully, I can have some impact on on Canada, okay, because that's the place where I'd grown up. And I was spending a lot of time in the US. And so, you know, I tell the story because I think many of you talked about the impact you wanted to have, which is to improve the community in which you live in, okay? And so Kenya, for me, although I love the country, was a country that I'd left when I was very young, and we kind of had settled in Canada. And so I thought to myself something that many people would have thought, which is, why is it that the Canadian entrepreneurial ecosystem is so much worse than the US one? Okay, same way, why is the Bangladeshi entrepreneurial ecosystem so much worse than the US one? And, you know, this wasn't a brilliant idea. I'm sure there were lots of people who had this same idea. But I tell the story that I happened to be walking down the street where University of Toronto is located, and this is 20 years ago. And I went into the Department of Economics, knocked on the door of the dean. The assistant there said, look, you don't have an appointment, you can't see him. And the dean sort of poked his head out, and I said, can I just come in and meet with you? And he was kind enough to meet with me. And effectively, I told him about this problem, which he said, yeah, everyone knows there's a prosperity gap and the Canadian ecosystem isn't doing anywhere as near as what it should be. And I thought to myself, well, you know what? Part of this is expectations and exposure, which is something that Aspire is trying to do, which is sort of expand people's expectations by providing them with exposure to people who look like them and who've been able to have real impact. And so he said, well, why don't you just come and do a guest lecture? And I said, no, you know what? I know I'm living in New York, but I'll come here every week. I want a course. I want to teach a course that's fully accredited at the University of Toronto. And he said, well, have you ever taught before? I said, no. He said, do you have a PhD? I said, no. And he said, well, why would I give you this course? Like, why would I mean, you know, we've got people here who've done nothing but teach classes. And I said, look, it's going to be really good, and I'm fully committed. I want to do this. I'm not just going to guest lecture. Trust me. And the reality is he took a bet, but the only reason he took a bet is because of my commitment. Okay. And of course, that decision changed my life, because over the past 20 years, I found lots of joy and impact through teaching, right? Creating centers here at Harvard, other things in this stream. But the reality is it would never have happened had I not trusted my instincts and knocked on the door, right? And so my point is, again, it's not about the idea per se, right? Everyone has these ideas, whether it's looking at the car and seeing these storage facilities, or walking down the street thinking, why is it that these outcomes aren't as good as you want, okay? It's more about actually trusting yourself that your idea may be worthwhile and you may be the person to solve it, and knocking on the door. But knowing that once you knock on the door or you stop the car, it's the way to convince someone is to show real commitment. Now, you have to believe that you're fully committed. You can't fake it, right? But once you're committed, that magic can really happen, okay? And so I'm not denigrating the fact that there's lots of pressures in all of you. I'm just saying to you that with commitment, you really can explore what your upside can look like. So judgment leads to commitment. Commitment leads to the next phase, which again I title magic, but the magic is really the learning, right? Yes, hopefully you get some power and some money, but what you really get as a founder is learning. Because as a founder, you're actually every day making hundreds of decisions that are consequential and that you're accountable for, right? You're not an employee being told what to do. You're actually making these decisions, testing your judgment, learning as much as possible, okay? And it's through that learning that you end up getting, I think, the thing that is most valuable and that we all want, which is impact, right? Which is an impact to make the world better, to make your family better, to make you better, to make your village better, whatever it may be, right? Judgment leads to commitment, leads to magic, leads to impact. And I want you to think very hard about those four things and how they play a role in your lives, okay? So let me pause. I think we've got, we have a few minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions, whether you want to put them in chat or whether you want to ask me directly. But remember those 4 words: judgment, commitment, magic, impact. And really think about solving for learning, which is all about making consequential decisions. Put yourself in situations where you're testing your judgment early, which means you embrace judgment. By definition, implies some risk, right? It wouldn't require judgment if it was foolproof, right? So you can't wait for perfect information to make decisions. You have to make these decisions with imperfect information, and there's real benefit. I know what you see as the cost, which is you may get it wrong. The benefit is the learning you get from that judgment, okay? And if I had to say what is the key success criteria, I've taught, tens of thousands of founders and have founded a number of businesses and worked with founders. It is this ability to exercise their judgment and not be scared of failure. And it doesn't mean that you don't have real practical issues with it. It just means that there is an upside to it, which is you learn from it. Okay, so I guess, Jenny, I'm happy to close it or answer a couple of questions, whatever you think makes sense.
I think it could be exciting to invite a few folks who have raised their hand on stage for a question, if that works for you. So I see that Fatumata Conte from Gambia, you've raised your hand. I sent you an invite if you want to join us on the stage. You might have to turn on your audio and your video. But we'd love to hear your question.
Just before you speak, while you're turning your thing,
Mm-hmm.
the other thing I will tell you also is, in moments of crisis, right? Like part of the difficulty of being a founder is inevitably there will be moments of crisis, right? You'll be close to running out of money, you'll lose an employee, you'll lose a key customer. And it's exactly in those moments of crisis that our founder is trained to make the right decisions, right? It is in those moments of crisis because they've actually been training themselves on judgment all the way through. And so to me as a founder, I know there are going to be curveballs happening all the time, okay? But I also know that I can trust my judgment to more often than not get it right because I've led a life of making decisions up until this point. Anyway, go ahead. Is it Fatumata?
Yes, thank you, Professor, and thank you, Jenny. While you were actually on this, I felt like you were speaking to me when you talked about the practice of judgment on small things. I have this idea that I believe that it's so small, and while I was young, I was still doing it manually. So while I was growing up, I realized there were a lot of people doing it. So I was like, this is not an area for me to go because people with resources, with money already is doing it. So you talked about people that have resources that would do it, but in my case, that are already doing it. So I've been skeptical and even venturing in it because I've already seen other people doing it that has more resources than I did or than I do.
Let me answer that. I mean, invariably, and look, we don't have time to get into the actual product, but what I would say to you is invariably when I hear this, I would say to you, go explore it. Meaning exploration isn't a year-long commitment, right? Exploration could be as simple as just, in I'm using this metaphor of stop the car. Like what I'm suggesting is it may be true that someone else has captured the opportunity or someone, but clearly you're intrigued by it because you think there may be a way to deliver this in a better format. And so what I would encourage you to do is when you have those ideas, just trust your instincts and explore it a little more, meaning go talk to customers, go do a study of the competition, go understand whether there's a real opportunity. And you may find out that your idea wasn't a good idea, but you may find out that it was a good idea and then you'll do a little more work. And so my point to you is it's always beneficial to take that first step rather than to just stand on the sidelines and not know. Because if nothing else, you're starting to trust your judgment. And even if you get it wrong, meaning and I'm not saying that you get it wrong fatally, I'm just saying you spend a weekend working on it and you decide it didn't make sense, that is very powerful learning. That is very powerful learning in terms of what you got wrong as part of your judgment. Okay, so I would encourage you almost invariably to to explore it. Anyone else, Jenny?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm seeing a question in the chat that might seem interesting from Mariette from Cameroon, who's asked how to know when to quit an initiative that isn't working for you and to move on to the next.
Okay, so this is very interesting, right? Because what I will tell you is as a founder, some of the most magical moments have happened when things looked most bleak, okay, when things looked most desperate. And there's some logic around that, because what people see is you're so committed to this, okay, that wow, you really believe in this. I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to be your customer. I'm going to be an investor, whatever it may be, okay? So I would say to you that, you know, as a founder, you do need a deep commitment. Now, the question around when, I mean, obviously sometimes it's going to fail. And so how do you, so what I always say is persevere for so long as you can fail well. Okay, so what that means, persevere for so long as you can fail well. So what does that mean? That means keep at it unless you're breaking laws, unless you're unable to kind of feed, you know, you're losing too much money, unless you're losing your reputation, all these sorts of things, right? Like you don't want to cross any lines, but I would just say to you that, you know, you all, what I've seen oftentimes is people fail far too early, right? And so think about it logically, which is the reason the gains of entrepreneurship are so high is because it's hard. And so you need this mindset knowing that it's going to be hard. And so it doesn't mean you're silly or unethical or anything like that, but you just have to know that it's going to be hard and that there are many people around you who are going to tell you it's not going to work, it's going to fail, you have no shot. And that doesn't mean you don't listen to them, you don't process it, but you just need to know that the reason the opportunity exists is because so many other people are on the sidelines not wanting to move forward. And so your opportunity is to actually step forward. You know, someone asked about how do you build self-confidence? So again, I think it's all part one and the same, which is the way to build self-confidence is to start putting yourself in situations where you're not confident, okay? Which I know is a very hard thing to do. It's a counterintuitive thing to do. But trust me, by doing that, you will learn a lot about yourself, okay? You will actually learn that you're capable of putting yourself in those situations. And if it doesn't work out, you'll learn what to do next to make it better. And so I think this self-confidence point is a very important thing to work on. And I think you just have to push yourself to realize that the best way to learn and increase your confidence is to actually operate in places that you're most nervous about operating in, which is in those periods of points of discomfort and points of uncertainty. I think I have time for one more, Jenny, if you want to pick one.
Sure. Abdullah Awan from Pakistan, I've sent you an invitation to speak. If you're able to accept that and join us on stage, we'd love to hear your question.
Hello everyone. I hope you all can hear me.
Yes.
It was a very great session. First of all, thank you so much for all your time and your efforts. Thank you, Aspire team, for all that. So my question or something I wanted to ask is, what if at some time we get to know that we need some kind of resources to get things start off, or what if at some time we need some resources, but still we are not able to cope up things without those resources?
Yeah, so I think this is a common problem, and obviously it's more extreme in certain parts of the world. But invariably, the resource that most people want is more information, right? And as a founder, you never have enough information to make the decision. And so you've got to start operating, you know, where you're making these decisions with imperfect information. You know, obviously other resources would be things like, you know, capital, relationships, networks, and these are very real things. And ultimately, you've got to think hard about the ways in which you can attract that to your proposition. And so, you know, and it all, again, comes down to, you know, are you able to process limited information in a way where you're making better judgments and actually demonstrating some traction or an opportunity that resources will ultimately flow to you. And that's the trick, right? That's the the really hard part of being an entrepreneur is you never have enough resources. You're constantly trying to figure out how to get them. And so the only way to do it is to be able to show that whatever the information you have is, you're able to demonstrate that there's a real opportunity there and that you can actually execute on it with all the uncertainty and imperfection around it. And so, what I've learned early in my career is you want as many people rooting for your success as possible, right? Meaning the people that you work with, the people you work for, whoever it may be, such that they back you, support you, provide you with resources as needed. But it's clearly, this is the key of, and that's why I define entrepreneurship as the relentless pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. Because frankly, nothing would ever be built if it was focused just on the resources you have. But I hear you that you've got to be able to have enough to actually get started. And so, again, my advice to you is it's all about creating networks and having access and trying to demonstrate judgment such that people are willing to support you. Okay. So listen, I'm gonna close. First of all, I apologize for the technological problems, but I'm thrilled you guys are in this program, and I would just say to you that I understand that people are coming from very different backgrounds, but I would just ask you, start making small decisions and trusting your judgment and explore the ideas you have. Trust your instincts around those ideas and really keep as your North Star this impact point that you wrote at the beginning of the class. Staple that on your wall and just make sure that the decisions you're making as you walk through life are consistent with the impact that I hope you have. Okay, so with that, I'll say goodbye and good luck.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Satchu. We've seen such amazing engagement from our participants, and I know they're really value everything you shared with us today. So thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Good luck.
Bye. Thank you.